Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The desert stretched out in long red dust flats, broken only by low shrubs and scattered canyon walls. Nayeli rode her small bay mare steadily toward the supply post near Miller's Ridge. She had promised to deliver dried herbs and stitching tools to the local healer before sundown. It was the only work she could secure without drawing questions about her future. The air was already dry and heavy. She could taste sand on her tongue each time she shifted her breath. Nayeli had lived in this border town for 3 years. She came after her husband died in a mining accident, choosing distance over the expectations her husband's relatives placed on her. They treated her with courtesy, but they planned her life without asking her what she wanted. She tried to survive quietly, earning coin through trade and keeping to herself. Most townspeople respected her, but they watched her from a distance, unsure whether she belonged more to her Apache roots or to the settler world she now depended on. As she rode today, she felt the familiar tightness in her stomach, the early signs of a sandstorm. The wind changed direction, shifting quickly enough to raise her pulse. She pulled her horse to a stop, scanning the horizon. A brown wall of dust was forming at the far end of the flats. "Not good," she muttered, gripping the reins. She knew she had 30 minutes at most. The nearest shelter was an old line shack used by ranch hands during long cattle drives. She remembered its location from a previous journey and turned her mare toward it, urging the tired animal forward. Each minute, the wind grew sharper, pushing sand against her skin. When she reached the shack, she saw the door half closed, moving slightly with the wind. She hoped it was empty. She needed a place to breathe and calm her nerves before the storm trapped her outside. She dismounted quickly, brushed dust from her face, and pushed the door open. A man sat inside, near a small fire. Calder Hayes looked up from the tin cup in his hands. He was a tall rancher with narrow shoulders and a worn, sunburned face. Scars marked his knuckles and his left forearm, injuries from ranch work, barbed wire, and small accidents that accumulated over years of isolation. He was known in town for speaking rarely and for leaving before conversations became personal. He owned a modest ranch north of Dry Creek, but spent most of his time riding fence lines alone. Calder had come to the line shack to check stray cattle reported by a neighbor. The storm caught him midway, leaving him no choice but to take shelter. He had been sitting here for nearly an hour, silently preparing for a long, enclosed night. When Nayeli stepped in, he stared for a second longer than she expected, not with suspicion, but with recognition. She remembered their last meeting, 3 months earlier, when he pulled her away from a runaway wagon before it tipped. They exchanged no words after that day. He just nodded and left. Now he nodded again, a small, quiet acknowledgement. "You should get inside before it closes in," he said, his voice low and steady. His tone carried no judgment, but Nayeli still felt her heart beating fast. She didn't like being trapped in small spaces with anyone, especially someone she barely knew. She closed the door against the rising wind, brushing sand from her braid. "Storm came in early," she said, mostly to fill the space. "It did," Calder answered simply. He shifted his gear aside, leaving room for her near the fire. She hesitated only a moment before sitting down. Warmth settled into her fingers, easing the sting of the cold dust outside. The shack itself was cramped, just a stove, a wooden bunk, a broken chair, and some old branding tools left by ranch hands years ago. The walls rattled lightly as the storm pushed against them. Each sound made Nayeli's shoulders tense. She tried to keep her worry controlled, but she could feel old stress rising. She hated storms. They reminded her of the mine collapse, how fast the world could close in without warning. She never said this aloud, but memories still pulled at her throat when she heard heavy wind. Calder watched her quietly. He wasn't staring, but he was studying her posture, noticing the tightness in her jaw and the way she breathed through her nose in short bursts. "You all right?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "I will be," she said, though her hands trembled slightly. "Just need a moment." He didn't move closer. He didn't try to calm her with words. He kept the fire steady instead, adding a small piece of wood, adjusting the vent. It gave her something to focus on. Minutes passed with only the sound of wind hitting the shack. Nayeli felt her pulse slow. She appreciated Calder's restraint. He didn't press her with questions or try to fill the silence. His presence was calm, stable, something she didn't expect to rely on but found herself noticing. Calder, for his part, felt a pressure in his chest he couldn't quite name. He wasn't good with people. He preferred distance. Yet seeing her afraid stirred something in him, an instinct to help, not because he expected anything, but because he understood what silent fear looked like. He carried enough of it himself. She finally spoke again, hoping conversation would distract her. "What brings you out here?" she asked. Herds scattered. "Neighbor thought some cattle came this way," he said. "Storm blocked the trail before I found them." She nodded. "I was delivering supplies to Miller's Ridge. Didn't make it in time." Silence returned, but this time it felt less sharp. Sharing simple facts grounded them both. It reminded Nayeli that neither of them chose to be here. The storm forced their paths together. She relaxed enough to unfasten her saddlebag and take out a small water skin. Calder shifted the tin cup toward her. "You can use this." She hesitated before accepting it. The gesture was small, but it broke through some of the distance she kept between herself and others. The fire's brightness softened Calder's worn expression, making him look less severe, more human. Outside, the wind strengthened. Sand struck the walls in steady bursts. The shack groaned under the pressure. Nayeli exhaled slowly, grounding herself. She wasn't alone. She wasn't outside. She wasn't powerless. Calder kept his eyes on the fire, but his thoughts drifted. He wondered how she managed to survive after everything she went through. Losing a husband, living between two worlds, tried to keep her life intact while others tried to control it. He respected her strength, but also saw the strain she tried to hide. As the storm locked them in for the night, both understood the next hours would test their patience and their guarded hearts. They prepared themselves quietly. Nayeli by steadying her breathing and keeping her thoughts in order, Calder by settling against the wall, ready to protect the small space from whatever damage the storm might bring. Neither knew it yet, but this forced shelter would change the direction of their lives. The wind drove harder against the lined shack as the last of the daylight disappeared. The fire inside crackled softly, giving the room a steady glow that pushed back the sense of being trapped. Nayeli kept her eyes on the flames, trying to settle the pressure building in her chest. The storm had sealed them in completely, and the sound of sand scraping across the walls reminded her how far they were from town, from help, from anyone who could intervene if things worsened. Calder stood up to check the window shutters. The boards rattled in his hands, but they held firm. When he turned back, Nayeli noticed how methodically he moved, slow, deliberate, grounded. He wasn't rattled by the storm, and that steadiness eased some of her tension. She wasn't used to relying on others, but his quiet presence gave her something to anchor herself to. He sat down again, close enough to hear her breathing shift whenever the wind struck harder. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the cold air seep through the thin walls. "You should rest a little," he said, not looking directly at her. "Storm won't break soon." "I won't sleep," she said. "Not with the wind like this." Calder nodded once. He didn't push. Instead, he adjusted the fire again, as if maintaining its brightness was the only way he could help without crossing boundaries. After several long minutes, the uncertainty that had been sitting in Nayeli's stomach finally pushed its way up. She had been carrying the weight of her late husband's family for weeks, pretending their pressure meant nothing. But the quiet of the shack made it impossible to ignore. She could feel Calder watching her carefully, not intruding, just aware. "They came to my door 3 days ago," she said suddenly. "His brothers." Calder didn't interrupt. He simply straightened his posture, giving her his full attention. "They said I should return to their land," she continued, "that a widow has duties, that I've stayed here long enough." Her fingers tightened around the blanket. I didn't answer. I closed the door. "But they'll come again." Her voice carried exhaustion she usually hid from others. Calder sensed how long this fear had been collecting inside her. He knew the town wondered why she kept to herself, why she moved cautiously when family matters were mentioned. Now the reason was clear. "You don't want to go back," he said, not as a question, but as a simple statement. No, she whispered. I built a life here. Not much of one, but it's mine. Calder leaned his arms on his knees. They got no right to take it from you. She swallowed hard. Hearing someone say it out loud steadied her more than she expected. It also exposed how desperately she needed someone to understand her struggle. She wasn't looking for rescue. She wanted acknowledgement of the fight she had been carrying alone. The storm hit the shack with a sharp burst, causing her flinch. Calder noticed. He moved one step closer, not touching her, just shifting his presence so she didn't feel isolated. His closeness wasn't overwhelming. It was grounding. Nayeli drew a shallow breath. I know I should stand up to them. I've tried, but they don't listen. They think they're doing what's proper. You don't owe them your life, he said quietly. His voice carried a firmness she didn't expect. Not anger, but a kind of conviction that came from years of deciding his own path, no matter how lonely it made him. She wondered how a man who avoided nearly everyone could speak so confidently when defending someone else's freedom. Outside, the wind shifted again, lowering from a scream to a steady roar. The fire popped loudly, and the shack finally stopped shaking as violently. The change allowed Nayeli to breathe deeper. Calder broke the silence first. I saw them near the mercantile last week, he said. Thought they were looking for someone. Her stomach tightened. Did they ask about me? No, but they watched people coming and going. Looked uneasy. He paused. Didn't look like men who planned to take no for an answer. His words sank in heavily, confirming what she already sensed but tried to deny. She lowered her gaze to her hands, tracing the rough patches on her fingers from long days of sewing and trade work. She wondered how long she could keep resisting without help. Calder watched her struggle with the thought. It unsettled him more than he expected. He wasn't used to worrying about anyone else's future, but seeing her frightened stirred a quiet protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. You're not alone, he said, surprising even himself. Nayeli looked up sharply. Calder held her gaze only a moment before lowering his eyes again. He wasn't offering promises, but he wasn't stepping back either. His words were simple, direct, and without hesitation. She realized he meant them. The storm outside began to weaken. The rattling softened into distant gusts. The air inside felt warmer, more stable. Nayeli drew a long breath, letting her shoulders relax for the first time that day. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The stillness between them carried a mutual understanding, one that neither had asked for, but both now shared. As the fire settled into a slow burn and the storm pushed further down the canyon, Nayeli adjusted her blanket and leaned slightly toward the warmth. Calder remained alert beside her, keeping watch on the shifting wind and the shifting fear in her eyes. They waited together in silence, each aware that the struggles waiting beyond this storm would test them far more than the desert ever could. The storm weakened through the night, falling into long stretches of quiet wind and distant rumbling. By the time the first gray light pushed through the cracks in the window shutters, the air inside the shack felt still again. Nayeli opened her eyes slowly, realizing she had drifted into light sleep at some point. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. Calder sat against the far wall, boots on the floor, hat lowered just enough to show he hadn't slept much. She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, pulling herself upright. The storm had passed, but the unease in her chest had not fully lifted. Calder noticed the tension on her face immediately. Winds died down, he said quietly. We can ride out soon. She nodded, though the morning calm didn't ease her thoughts. The night had forced her to speak truths she usually locked away. Now, in silence, she wondered what Calder thought of her fear, her uncertainty, her inability to decide what to do about her late husband's family. She also realized she didn't know much about Calder beyond rumors. Why a man like him kept to himself, what he carried behind his silence, and why he seemed so ready to defend her without expecting anything in return. She took a breath, steadying her voice. I didn't mean to trouble you last night. You didn't, he said simply. There was no softness in his tone, but no hardness either. Just a plain statement, as if the idea of her being a burden never crossed his mind. He stood, stretched his back, and picked up his saddlebag. When he reached for the door, he paused, his hand resting against the frame. Something weighed on him. She could see it in the way he hesitated, searching for a way to speak. When your husband's family came to take you back, he began, did you have anyone to stand with you? The question hit deeper than she expected. She shook her head. No, I told them I wouldn't return, but people kept their distance. Didn't want to be in the middle of something that wasn't theirs. Calder let out a slow exhale. The fact sat heavily with him. It explained why she always looked ready to move at a moment's notice, why she kept her voice low when speaking about anything that could be used against her, why she reacted so strongly to the storm. Too many moments in her life had left her feeling alone. He turned back toward her fully. His stare was steady, not demanding, but focused in a way that made her heartbeat quicken. He wasn't angry. He was making a decision. I don't like seeing you pushed around, he said. She swallowed, unsure how to respond. He wasn't a man known for stepping into other people's lives. He avoided crowds, avoided conflict, avoided attachments that pulled him into responsibility. Yet here he stood, speaking as if protecting her was something he had been considering longer than he intended. She waited, breath held, wondering where he was going with this. Calder's voice lowered. If you had someone by your side, someone who'd speak for you, stand with you, they wouldn't try to force you again. Her pulse kicked, a mix of confusion and expectation she didn't want to name. He continued, each word slow and deliberate, chosen with care. I want a child from you. The sentence landed with sharp clarity. Nayeli froze. Her breath stopped. She stared at him, unable to mask the shock in her eyes. She waited for him to add a condition or a demand, but he said nothing else. Her mind raced, searching for meaning. She feared she misheard him, that he might be speaking out of responsibility or out of pity for her situation. But Calder's expression held no trace of obligation. He looked uncomfortable. Yes, awkward, even, but sincere. I'm not saying you owe me anything, he added. I'm not asking you to pay something back. I'm telling you what I want. Nayeli's heart thudded against her ribs. She wasn't used to being chosen. She wasn't used to a man speaking to her as if she had value beyond expectation or tradition. She tried to gather her thoughts, but they slipped through her fingers. Why? She finally whispered. Calder shifted his stance. Because I've spent too many years with nothing but chores and fence posts. Because I don't want to live out my life without building something that matters to me. And because when I look at you, he stopped, searching for a way to finish without saying too much. I see someone who doesn't run from hard things. Nayeli felt heat build behind her eyes. Not tears, not yet, but the ache of a truth she didn't want to face. She longed for stability, for a home where she wasn't under someone's control, for a life built with choice rather than pressure. But she was afraid of accepting something she didn't fully understand. She lowered her gaze. You hardly know me. I know enough, he said quietly. And the rest, we'd learn. The offer wasn't loud or dramatic. It was rough around the edges, delivered without grace, but it came from a place of honesty she couldn't ignore. Nayeli turned away, stepping out into the damp morning air. The sky was pale, streaked with dust still drifting from a storm. She felt unsteady, unsure how to breathe normally after hearing words she never expected, words that could change the direction of her life if she allowed them. Behind her, Calder stepped out of the shack but kept a respectful distance. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't demanding an answer. He was simply waiting, giving her space to decide if his words held meaning for her or if they were too heavy to accept. Nayeli stared at the horizon, her heartbeat slowly returning to a manageable rhythm. She didn't know what choice she would make, but for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel as fixed or as narrow as before. She mounted her mare with careful movements. Calder saddled his horse as well. They rode in silence toward town, not as strangers, not as a pair, but as two people standing at the edge of change they could neither define nor deny. The distance between them held tension, uncertainty, and an unspoken question, one that would not disappear with the fading storm. The trail toward town was quiet in the early morning light. The storm had left the ground packed and dark, with small ridges of sand collected around the brush. Nayeli rode a few paces ahead, her posture stiff, her thoughts tangled. Calder followed slightly behind, giving her room while also keeping close enough to step in if anything threatened. Neither spoke, but the silence between them held the weight of what had been said in the shack. His intention, her shock, and the uncertainty that now shaped every breath she took. As the settlement came into view, Naeli slowed her horse. The wooden storefronts, narrow alleys, and rows of hitching posts were beginning to fill with townspeople starting their day. She felt her pulse rise. Returning after spending the night with someone, especially someone as reserved and solitary as Calder, would draw attention. The town was not cruel, but it watched everything. People filled quiet places with assumptions, and Naeli could already sense the shift in curiosity from the few faces that noticed them riding in together. Calder dismounted first at the water trough and tied his horse. Naeli followed slowly. She wanted to step away quickly, avoid questions, and regain control of her breath. But Calder spoke before she walked off. "I'll walk with you," he said. His tone was level, not announcing anything, not claiming her, just offering support. Still, the gesture would be noticed. A man like Calder didn't walk with anyone unless it mattered. She studied his expression, searching for hesitation, but he met her eyes calmly. If he was nervous about how the town might read this, he hid it well. She gave a small nod. "All right." They walked side by side toward the mercantile. People paused, some briefly, others more openly. The blacksmith narrowed his eyes, assessing the distance between them. Two women carrying baskets slowed their steps, whispering to each other without hiding it. The saloon keeper leaned against the post, arms crossed, watching with a neutral expression that hid curiosity. Naeli felt heat rise to her cheeks. She hated being the center of attention. Her hands tightened around the strap of her saddlebag. Calder noticed her discomfort, and although he didn't touch her, he adjusted his stride so he remained slightly closer, a steady presence she could lean on without anyone noticing. Inside the mercantile, she placed the goods on the counter while Calder stood a step behind her. Mr. Felden, the shop owner, glanced between them, first with surprise, then with a hint of suspicion. "Morning," he said carefully. "Morning," Naeli replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Calder nodded once in greeting. Felden's attention lingered on him longer than necessary before returning to the items Naeli delivered. "You made it through the storm, then?" "Found shelter," she said simply. Felden raised an eyebrow, as if he wanted more details, but Calder's stillness behind her discouraged further questions. The owner said nothing else. When they stepped outside, she let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Calder remained beside her, scanning the street. He wasn't looking for threats. He was gauging who was watching and why. "You don't need to walk with me the whole way," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "I'm choosing to." His answer unsettled her, not in a frightening way, but in a way that pushed against the guarded part of her heart. She wasn't used to someone choosing to stand with her without a demand attached. Ahead, near the well, she noticed 3 riders, her late husband's relatives. Their horses were dusty, their clothes travel-worn. They watched her immediately, then shifted their gaze to Calder. Their expressions tightened. It was clear they didn't expect to see her return to town accompanied by another man, especially one known for avoiding entanglements. Her stomach dropped. Calder caught the change in her breathing and followed her line of sight. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "They came back early," he said. "Yes," she whispered. The riders didn't approach, but their stare made their intentions obvious. They were taking note, drawing conclusions, preparing their next move. Naeli felt exposed again, the same vulnerability she had fought the night before. But Calder stepped slightly ahead, positioning himself between her and the riders. Not aggressively, just enough to block the direct line of their gaze. It grounded her more than she expected. "Do you want to go home?" he asked. She nodded. "I think so. I'll take you," he said. She hesitated. "Calder, I don't want them to think that I'm forcing you into anything," he finished. "Let them think whatever they want. You decide what's true." His tone was steady, without hesitation. His willingness to stand with her wasn't performative. It was clear he meant every word he had spoken earlier, even if she wasn't ready to respond. They rode toward her small house at the edge of town. Her breath slowly evened out as they put distance between themselves and the riders. When they reached her door, she dismounted and faced him. He didn't push for an answer, didn't repeat anything from the morning, didn't expect anything in return. "I'll be nearby if you need anything," he said. She studied him for a moment, seeing no judgment, no pressure, only sincerity. She gave a slight nod. Calder turned his horse and rode toward the northern ridge, leaving her with a mix of relief and confusion. She stepped inside her home, closed the door, and placed her hand on her chest, tried to understand the shift taking place inside her. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the early shape of a choice, one shaped by her own will, not by the expectations of others. Outside, Calder disappeared into the rising dust, unaware of how deeply his quiet presence had begun to steady the fractures in her life. The sun climbed higher as the riders, her late husband's relatives, remained in town longer than usual. Their presence weighed on Naeli's mind throughout the morning. She tried to focus on sorting herbs, repairing a torn saddle strap, and sweeping the small porch, but her thoughts drifted repeatedly to the looks they had exchanged earlier. They had not spoken a word, yet their silence carried a clear intention. They still believed her life was theirs to reclaim. She moved through her house with careful steps, listening to the quiet. The stillness should have comforted her, but it brought a low tension that pressed against her ribs. She wondered if they would return today, if they planned to confront her directly, if they would push harder after seeing her ride with Calder. She had no clear answer. Hours passed before a knock came at her door. 3 firm taps. Not hesitant, not polite. Her breath tightened. She opened it slowly. Her husband's 2 brothers and a cousin stood outside. Their clothing was dusty from travel. Their expressions were stiff, already carrying judgment before she said a word. Their leader, the older brother, stepped forward. "We spoke last week," he said. "You never answered." Naeli kept her posture straight. "I answered by staying here." "That isn't an answer," he replied sharply. "You have obligations. Family obligations." Naeli held his stare. "My life is here." The cousin's gaze drifted past her shoulder, scanning the interior of her home as if deciding what belonged to him. A flicker of anger tightened her chest. "You married into our family," the brother said. "That does not end with death." "It ended the day he was buried," she said quietly. "I honored him. I mourned him. But my life is mine." Their expressions hardened. The eldest brother seemed ready to force the issue, his tone shifting from persuasion to command. Before he could step closer, a rider approached from the dirt road. Calder slowed his horse near the fence, watching the scene with a controlled, unreadable expression. He dismounted without urgency, secured the reins, and walked toward the house. He didn't carry a weapon visibly, but the firmness in his posture sent a clear message that he wasn't going to be dismissed. The brothers turned toward him with immediate hostility. "This is family business," one said. Calder stopped a few steps from Naeli's porch. "She decides that. Not you." The eldest brother squared his shoulders. "Who are you to speak on her decision?" Calder didn't raise his voice. "A man who respects her right to choose her own life." Naeli felt a wave of conflicting emotions, fear from her relative's pressure, and a steadying warmth from Calder's presence. She never asked for his help, yet he stepped forward as if the choice had already been made long before today. "She belongs with her husband's people," the cousin insisted. "It's our duty to bring her home." Calder's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "You don't own her." The porch fell silent. The wind moved lightly through the dust, and the sound of a loose hinge tapped somewhere nearby. The tension hovered so sharply that Naeli could feel her heartbeat against her ribs. The brother glared. "You think standing here changes anything?" "No," Calder said. "She changes it." He turned his head slightly toward Naeli, not pressing her, not guiding her, only giving her room to speak if she chose to. Naeli took a slow breath. Her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied them at her sides. She had run from her past out of necessity, but she was done letting others dictate her future. "I'm not returning with you," she said. "This is my home. My work, my friends, my community, they are here. I won't live under someone else's authority." The cousin opened his mouth, but the brother raised a hand, silencing him. His frustration was clear. He had expected obedience, not resistance. "You've made a foolish choice," he said coldly. "Don't expect us to rescue you when things go wrong." Naeli didn't flinch. "I'm not asking you to." He stared at her one last time, searching for weakness, doubt, anything he could use, but she gave him nothing. With a final glare at Calder, he turned back to his horse. The others followed, climbing into their saddles with stiff movements. They rode off, leaving a trail of dust drifting behind them. When they disappeared beyond the ridge, Naeli let out the breath she'd been holding for too long. Her legs felt unsteady. Calder stepped closer, but kept his hands at his sides. "You handled that," he said quietly. "I tried," she replied, her voice soft but controlled. "You didn't try," he corrected. "You did." His tone wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement. She appreciated that more than any comforting words. She leaned lightly against the porch rail, grounding herself. Calder waited, giving her the time she needed to steady her breathing. When she finally met his eyes, she found no expectation there, only concern. "They'll come again," she said. "They might," he agreed, "but not like this." She didn't ask what he meant. She understood. Their attempt had failed today, and they wouldn't approach her without realizing the town was watching and that Calder stood closer to her life than anyone expected. After a long pause, she spoke again. "Thank you for being here." Calder nodded. "You won't face them alone." The simplicity of his promise struck deeper than she expected. She felt something shift inside her, a slow, cautious understanding that his intentions were not momentary or impulsive. He was steady, deliberate, and willing to stand where others would not. As he mounted his horse to give her space, Naeli realized she was no longer trapped between worlds. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the beginning of a home she might choose freely, without fear. And Calder, riding toward the ridge with quiet purpose, carried the same thought. Protecting her was no longer a question. It had become part of the life he wanted to build. The tension of the confrontation lingered in town long after Naeli's relatives disappeared beyond the ridge. News traveled quietly from porch to porch, carried by shopkeepers and ranch hands who pretended not to gossip, but always did. Some spoke with surprise that Calder stepped in at all. Others admitted they had wondered for months how far Naeli would be pushed before someone defended her. No one approached her directly, but the atmosphere around her softened in subtle ways. People who once kept distance now greeted her more openly, and the healer left a small bundle of herbs at her door without explanation. Life did not suddenly change, but the edges around her isolation began to shift. Naeli herself felt a steadiness she hadn't known in years. The fear of being reclaimed had followed her like a shadow since her husband's death, tightening her chest with each sunrise. Now, after speaking her decision aloud with Calder beside her, the weight eased, though she knew the conflict wasn't entirely over. Her relatives were proud men, and used to being ignored. Their anger would simmer before it faded. Yet she no longer faced that fear alone, and that changed everything. Over the next week, her days returned to their usual rhythm, gathering plants along the creek, sewing leather goods for trade, and tending her mare. But Calder appeared more frequently than before, each time with a reason that was simple but not forced. Some days he brought supplies needing repair. Other days he checked on the boundary fences that bordered her small property. He never lingered longer than she allowed, but he didn't leave abruptly either. Their interactions settled into an easy pattern, quiet, practical, and slowly familiar. On a warm afternoon, he found her near the fence behind her house, struggling to tighten a loose rail. She was bracing one end with her knee when the board slipped and nearly struck her. Calder caught it with one hand before it fell completely. "You're working with a weak post," he said. She stepped back, brushing dust from her palms. "It held yesterday." He tested the wood, pressing his thumb against the center until the grain cracked. "Won't hold tomorrow." She watched him assess the fence as if he had already made a plan before she arrived. She admired how he approached every problem. Steady hands, clear focus, no unnecessary talk. She didn't have to ask for help. He simply stepped in where he saw a needed task. "I can fix it," she said, though her tone wasn't defensive, more a statement of habit. "I know," he replied, "but I'm here." They replaced the board together. Naeli held the post straight while Calder hammered the new plank into place. The rhythm of the work eased her thoughts. With each strike, she felt a growing sense of safety. Not because he was strong or capable, but because he didn't treat her as fragile or dependent. He treated her as someone worth standing with. When the fence was secure, Calder gathered the tools while she wiped the sweat from her brow. He paused before handing her the hammer. "You've been looking over your shoulder," he said quietly. "Still expecting them to return?" She hesitated. "I don't know what they'll do. They weren't finished when they left." "You're right," he said. "They weren't." He fastened the tool bag closed. "But you don't have to live waiting for them." His certainty steadied her again. She studied him, trying to understand what pulled him into her life so suddenly and so decisively. She remembered his words in the shack, words she still didn't know how to respond to, but his intentions were no longer abstract. He showed them through small actions, through presence, through choices made without hesitation. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, not with fear, but with genuine curiosity. He didn't look away. "Because you deserve to decide your life, and because I don't want you carrying this alone." His honesty unsettled her in a different way, soft, warm, and careful. She felt herself open slightly to the idea that his intentions weren't based on impulse, but on who he was beneath his quiet exterior. Later that week, a small group of cattle wandered onto her property through a broken section of fence farther west. Naeli attempted to drive them off, but the animals moved stubbornly across the brush. Calder rode in without being called, having noticed the scattered tracks while checking his own land. They spent the afternoon guiding the stray cattle back toward their rightful range. Their movements formed a silent cooperation, Naeli circling wide on her mare, Calder pushing from the opposite side, both anticipating the other's decisions without speaking. When the last steer finally crossed the boundary, Naeli exhaled with exhaustion and unexpected satisfaction. "You handle a horse better than most ranch hands," Calder said as they rested near a wash. She smirked lightly. "My father taught me when I was young. He believed a woman should ride as well as any man if she lived on open land." Calder nodded with approval. He didn't question her heritage or speak with the strained politeness some settlers used when addressing Apache traditions. He simply accepted what she said, which eased something inside her that had been wary since she first arrived in the town. They talked a little longer. Nothing intimate, nothing that pressured her, just small truths, where they grew up, what they feared losing, how lonely a piece of land could feel without someone to share it with. Calder was not expressive, but he chose his words with care. Each answer revealed more than she expected, and each moment shared made his earlier confession feel less like an abrupt declaration and more like a deliberate desire shaped by years of solitude. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, they rode back toward town. The silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt familiar, steady, and slowly growing into something she could trust. When they reached her house, Calder pulled his reins gently. "You're safer than before," he said. "And you should know, I'm not stepping back from this." She felt warmth rise in her chest, a feeling she tried to control but couldn't fully push down. She nodded, though words didn't come easily. Calder rode off, leaving her at the gate. She watched him disappear into the dimming light, realizing that the ground beneath her life was changing, not through sudden events, but through steady presence, shared work, and the quiet bond forming between them. For the first time, she didn't fear what came next. She wondered what a different kind of life might look like. One chosen freely, one built slowly, one rooted in trust rather than obligation. And she realized she wasn't imagining it alone anymore. The next few days passed without trouble, but the calm felt fragile. People in town continued treating Naeli with more warmth, yet she still sensed something unresolved. The last confrontation with her husband's relatives hadn't ended in agreement or understanding. They had simply left. And men who carried pride the way they did rarely accepted defeat quietly. Near midday, while she was purchasing thread and dry berries at the mercantile, she noticed several townspeople glancing toward the street. Their expressions changed, tightened jaws, wary eyes, half-finished gestures. Naeli stepped outside to see what had drawn their attention. 3 riders had returned. Her husband's brothers and cousin sat on their horses near the well, watching the storefronts with rigid posture. Dust clung to their coats as if they had been traveling since dawn. Their presence froze the street. A few ranch hands stopped stacking crates. Children were rushed indoors. The space between the riders and the townspeople widened until the whole center of town felt tense. One of the brothers spotted Naeli and rode closer, the hooves of his horse clapping sharply on the packed dirt. She felt her pulse climb, but kept her shoulders firm. "We're not leaving without you this time," he said, voice flat and decisive. Naeli didn't move back. "I already gave my answer, and we already told you it wasn't yours to make." A handful of onlookers stepped aside as the other 2 riders dismounted. Their intent was clear. They weren't here to talk. They meant to take her. Before she could respond, footsteps sounded behind her. Calder walked into the street with controlled, steady pace. His hat shaded his eyes, but his expression made his position unmistakable. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. He didn't look at Naeli first. He looked at the men circling toward her, evaluating every movement. The brother turned toward him with scorn. "You should stay out of this." Calder didn't stop walking until he stood beside Naeli. "No." The single word carried more weight than any threat. His stance wasn't aggressive, but his calm confidence made the riders hesitate. They hadn't expected resistance from the town, much less from a man known for avoiding conflict. The eldest brother stepped forward, towering over both of them. "She belongs with her husband's family. That's the law we honor." Calder met his stare without blinking. "She chooses where she lives and who she builds her life with." The brother's jaw clenched. "You think standing next to her makes you part of this?" "It makes my intentions clear," Calder replied. His voice stayed level, unshaken. "And if you touch her, you'll answer to me." The street went still. No one dared interrupt. Naeli felt her pulse hammering, but not with panic. Calder's presence steadied her, even now, when tension could snap at any second. The cousin stepped forward aggressively. "You've known her a handful of weeks." Calder cut him off. "Enough time to see she deserves her own life." His tone wasn't loud, but it carried through the town like a line drawn in the dirt. The sheriff approached from the far end of the street, moving with authority rather than speed. He placed himself near the group, hand resting near his holster, not threatening, but prepared. "That's far enough," the sheriff said. "No one is taking her anywhere." She spoke her choice plainly. The eldest brother glared, frustrated not only at Naeli and Calder, but at the realization that the town itself no longer supported their claim. They expected fear, expected people to step aside, expected their status as her husband's kin to give them power. Instead, they found a wall of resistance formed by a quiet rancher and a sheriff unwilling to let them break the law. One last attempt came from the cousin. "You defy the family's rights." The sheriff replied calmly. "In this town, a widow's rights come first." The riders exchanged looks: anger, humiliation, disbelief. Calder watched their reactions closely, ready to move if they made a mistake. They didn't. Pride warred with stubbornness in the eldest brother's eyes before he finally turned his horse sharply. "This isn't the last we'll hear of this," he warned. Calder answered immediately, voice low but firm. "It is." The statement landed like a door closing. The riders hesitated only a moment more before pulling their reins and riding out of town. Dust trailed behind them as they disappeared down the southern trail, leaving a street full of relieved, uncertain townspeople. When silence settled again, Calder exhaled slowly. Naeli didn't realize she was trembling until he stepped slightly in front of her, blocking the remaining stares from the street. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her voice took a second to come. "I'm Al." The sheriff approached her, speaking gently. "You won't be bothered again. They're out of ground here." Naeli thanked him, though her gaze drifted back to Calder. He wasn't smiling, wasn't trying to comfort her with soft words. He simply remained where she needed him. close enough to show he wasn't going anywhere. When the sheriff stepped away, Calder turned toward her fully. You stood firm. So did you, she said softly. He shifted slightly, as if deciding whether to speak further. When he did, his tone carried the same honesty he had shown in the shack, but now with more certainty. You shouldn't have to face men like that alone, he said. Not now. Not ever. Naeli felt something inside her steady, a sense of safety she had never allowed herself to fully trust. His presence didn't trap her. It freed her from the fear that ruled her life for too long. She stepped closer, only an inch, but enough for him to understand she wasn't rejecting his intention. The street had emptied, leaving them in the quiet dust and sun. Thank you, she said. Calder gave a small nod. His eyes held a sincerity that warmed her chest in a way fear never had room for. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility he offered, not as a promise forced on her, but as a life she could choose. A future shaped by steady steps, shared work, and trust earned the hard way. She wasn't ready to say the words he once said to her, but she wasn't far from them anymore. The tension that had gripped the town finally eased in the days following the confrontation. People returned to their work, conversations lightened, and the lingering fear that Naeli's relatives would cause more trouble slowly faded. Yet for Naeli, the shift inside herself was the most significant change. The fear that once shaped every decision began to loosen, leaving space for thoughts she had been too afraid to entertain. Thoughts about stability, about trust, and about what a future with Calder might truly look like. She spent the next morning tending to small repairs inside her house, adjusting shelves and organizing her baskets of herbs, trying to make sense of the quiet. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind drifted toward Calder more than she wanted to admit. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, how long he would keep choosing to stand beside her. Each memory of him stepping forward, without demand, without expectation, pressed gently against the guarded parts of her heart. A knock sounded at her door. 3 light taps, familiar but cautious. When she opened it, Calder stood outside holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He didn't look nervous, but there was a seriousness in his expression she hadn't seen before. I brought you something, he said. She stepped aside to let him in. He set the bundle on her table and unwrapped it. Inside was a set of polished tools, sturdy needles, a leather punch, and a new stitching awl. They were well-crafted, not cheap, and clearly chosen with care. You don't have to give me things, she said softly. I know, he replied, but your tools were worn out. You work every day. I thought you could use better ones. Naeli traced her finger lightly along the smooth handle of the awl. It fit her hand perfectly. She swallowed, moved by the practicality of the gift. He didn't bring flowers or trinkets. He brought something that acknowledged her work, her independence, her identity. Thank you, she said, her voice steady but warm. He nodded once, then stepped back slightly as if giving her space even inside her own home. She sensed something else he had come to say, something heavier than the tools. She waited. Calder took a slow breath. I know I spoke out of turn that morning, he said. I said something big without giving you time. I want to make it clear. I'm not asking for anything from you unless it's something you want. Naeli's heart tightened. This honesty, so simple, so unadorned, held more weight than any grand gesture could. I know, she said quietly. I've been thinking about it. Calder didn't react visibly, but the flicker in his eyes showed how closely he was listening. I want a life that belongs to me, she continued. A home where I'm not controlled or judged. A place where I can build something real. She paused, searching his eyes. You've shown me I don't have to do it alone. Calder's stance softened, tension easing in his shoulders. He waited, letting her speak at her own pace. I don't want promises made in fear or in desperation, she added. I want choices made in certainty. He nodded. That's what I want too. The sincerity in his voice steadied her. She stepped closer to him, not touching, but closing the gap that had lingered between them for weeks. I'm not saying yes to everything yet, she said, but I'm saying yes to trying. Calder didn't reach for her. He didn't rush. He simply accepted her words with a quiet certainty. Then we'll build it slowly, he said. Whatever pace you choose. They talked for a while about what she needed to feel safe, about what he wanted for his ranch, about what a shared life might look like. They spoke plainly, grounding their hopes in practical plans rather than dreams. She told him she wanted space to bring her own traditions into the home. He told her he wanted a household shaped by partnership, not obligation. The conversation was steady, honest, and anchored by the respect that had grown between them since the storm. When afternoon light streamed through the window, Nayeli gathered a few of her belongings, a blanket stitched by her mother, a carved wooden bowl from her childhood, and a small pouch of her tools. She didn't pack everything. She wasn't moving today, but she wanted to bring pieces of herself to Calder's ranch, to see how it felt to shape a shared space. Calder waited outside with his horse saddled. Nayeli mounted her mare, her heartbeat steady and sure. They rode together toward his ranch, the trail quiet and open ahead of them. When they arrived, Calder showed her the room he rarely used, a small space with a window facing the hills, still and untouched. "Make it your own," he said. "Anything you want." Nayeli placed her blanket on the bed, smoothing it with careful hands. She set her bowl on the shelf and her tools on the small table near the lamp. The room changed instantly, not fully, not permanently, but enough to feel like the first step of something real. Calder stood in the doorway, watching her without intruding. "How does it feel?" he asked. She looked around the room, taking in the quiet, the sunlight, the simplicity. A sense of calm spread through her chest. "Like the beginning," she said. And Calder, hearing the certainty in her voice, felt his guarded life shift into something he had long wanted, yet never believed he would have. They didn't touch or embrace. They didn't rush into declarations. The moment didn't need it. The bond between them was forming in the way it always had, steadily, deliberately, and without fear. A home was taking shape, one step at a time. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that neither Nayeli nor Calder had ever known before. Their days unfolded with quiet purpose, repairing fences, tending livestock, preparing meals, and learning the small habits that made up each other's lives. There was no rush and no forced declarations. Their connection deepened through steady routines, shared work, and unspoken understanding. Nayeli found herself waking with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years, and Calder began speaking more freely, a sign that her presence was softening the walls he had built around himself. Nayeli brought more of her belongings to the ranch, woven baskets, her mother's tools, herbs for cooking, and blankets stitched with Apache patterns. Each item found a place in the house without conflict. Calder never questioned the changes. He accepted them as part of the home they were slowly shaping together. For the first time, Nayeli felt she was living in a place that reflected both her history and her future. One morning, while feeding the horses, she noticed a change in her body. Small signs she knew well, signs she had hoped for but never allowed herself to expect. She rested her hand on her lower stomach, standing still as the truth settled deep inside her. She was carrying a child. The realization brought a rush of emotion, joy mixed with fear, anticipation mixed with disbelief. This wasn't the child taken from her by obligation or tradition. This was a child created through choice, through trust, through a slow and deliberate bond. She took her time before telling Calder, wanting to be certain, wanting to feel steady enough to speak without trembling. When she found him near the barn repairing a latch, she approached with careful steps. Calder looked up, sensing something different in her expression. "Everything all right?" he asked. She nodded, then paused. "There's something I need to tell you." He set the tool aside and faced her fully, attentive and unguarded. She took a breath, steady but emotional. "I'm with child," she said softly. Calder didn't speak immediately. His eyes shifted slightly, absorbing the words. For a moment, he stood completely still, the weight of the news settling through him. Then his expression changed, not into surprise or fear, but into a quiet, controlled relief that carried more meaning than any spoken reaction. He stepped closer, stopping just before touching her. "You're sure?" "Yes," she said. I'm sure. A slow breath left him, as if years of restrained hope finally released. He didn't reach for her abruptly. Instead, he spoke with the calm honesty that had defined every step of their growing bond. Thank you for telling me. His voice was low, steady. And if you want this, if this is the life you choose, I'm here. All the way. Nayeli felt her throat tighten. She expected nervousness or hesitation, but Calder's acceptance was immediate and unwavering. The tenderness in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. I do want this, she said. I want this life. Calder nodded, something warm and determined settling into his eyes. Then we build it together. Over the next days, the news shaped their routines. Calder strengthened the corral fence and repaired the roof's weak boards, ensuring the ranch would hold strong through winter. Nayeli reorganized their home with small adjustments, placing herbs near the stove, preparing cloth, creating space for future needs. Neither rushed into celebration. They approached this milestone the way they approached everything else, carefully, respectfully, with quiet certainty. Word eventually reached her husband's family through distant relatives, but instead of returning, they sent a single message through a trader traveling near their land. The message was short. They acknowledged her decision and would not interfere again, whether out of resignation, respect for her choice, or recognition that she had built a new life beyond their reach. The final tie to her past loosened without conflict. With that last shadow lifted, Nayeli's heart settled completely. On a warm evening near sunset, Calder and Nayeli stood together on the porch overlooking the open land. The sky glowed with soft colors, and the cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. Try as she might to remain composed, Nayeli rested her hand over her stomach, feeling both the weight and the gift of the life growing inside her. Calder glanced at her hand, then at her face. He didn't speak, but he stepped closer until their shoulders nearly touched, a gesture that said everything he felt without needing words. She leaned gently into him, allowing herself to trust the moment fully. This wasn't the end of a struggle or the beginning of a fantasy. It was the steady continuation of a life built through resilience, choice, and quiet devotion. Nayeli felt no fear, no uncertainty, no doubt about where she belonged. Calder, once defined by solitude, now found purpose in the family they were creating together. The desert air cooled as the first stars appeared. Nayeli closed her eyes briefly, letting the peace settle into her chest. Their story had begun in a storm, shaped by silence and hardship, but it found its conclusion here, on solid ground, with a home built deliberately and a future chosen freely. And as the evening deepened, both of them understood something simple and certain. They were no longer two wounded souls surviving alone. They were a family,